Welcome to the second in a series of hearings in the Chemical Safety, Waste Management, Environmental Justice, and Regulatory Oversight Subcommittee on the environmental and public health dangers involved in the production, use, and disposal of plastics. I appreciate the support of Senator Carper and Ranking Member Capito for this set of hearings exploring these issues. In our first hearing, we established that plastic has some unique and amazing properties. There are a lot of specialized applications where these may be important and sometimes essential, but the majority of plastic is single-use plastic, and that there are significant challenges or harms caused by plastics to human health, to ecosystems, and to the environment. Today, we're going to hear from people who are impacted the most by plastic, those who live next to facilities where plastic is made, and facilities where it is disposed of, often by burning. Now, the goal is to better understand why plastic facilities are clumped together and the effect that they are having. You cannot tell the story of plastics without mentioning Cancer Alley in Louisiana. Cancer Alley is an 85-mile section covering 11 parishes along the Mississippi River between New Orleans and Baton Rouge that has high levels of toxic pollution. It accounts for some 25% of the nation's petrochemical production and has the largest concentration of chemical plants in the Western Hemisphere. The existence of 150 petrochemical plants in agricultural areas of Cancer Alley is the legacy of slavery. What was once plantations where enslaved Black Americans raised sugarcane has been replaced by petrochemical facilities. The free towns established when recently freed Black Americans lived as sharecroppers now sit right next door to these plants. And the state is not only not protecting them, it may in fact be discriminating. And I quote from a letter that EPA sent to Louisiana's Department of Environmental Quality, quote, EPA has significant concerns that Black residents and school children living and or attending school near the Denka facility have been subjected to discrimination through LDEQ's actions and inactions in the implementation of its air pollution control permit program. End of quote. And where does this plastic go when we're done with it? Too often it goes to the municipal solid waste incinerators, where it's burned, with air pollution emissions comparable to fossil fuel power plants. The burning of plastics releases toxic gases like dioxins, furans, mercury, polychlorinated biphenyls, and it causes a significant range of health maladies. It's no surprise that 79% of the 73 incinerators in the U.S. are located in low-income communities or communities of color. Of these facilities, 48 incinerators are located in communities where more than 25% of the population is below the federal poverty level. And policies that Congress included in the debt ceiling bill weaken the National Environmental Policy Act and will make it more difficult for overburdened frontline communities to protect themselves. There's a lot of talk about jobs, so let's get some statistics on that. The cities and communities historically dominated by petrochemical production are overwhelmingly poor, and building petrochemical facilities does not lead to significant job benefits or economic prosperity for the surrounding communities. Port Arthur is home to the nation's largest oil refinery operation, but it has an unemployment rate twice as high as Texas' average. Port Arthur ranks as Texas' poorest city with a poverty rate of 27.2%, double the Texas average of 14.2%, or almost double. A study by St. Gabriel in Louisiana found that just 9% of full-time industry jobs were held by local citizens, despite the town having an annual per capita income of just $15,000, a third below the state average and half the national average. Whether it's intentional discrimination or because of lack of qualifications for the work, the result is the same. The burden of these facilities are placed on communities that receive little to none of the benefits and receive all of the pollution. The jobs that are available come with the risk of serious health impacts. Workers producing plastic are at increased risk of leukemia, lymphoma, hepatic angiosarcoma, brain cancer, breast cancer, mesothelioma, neurotoxic injury, and decreased fertility. Workers producing plastic textiles die of bladder cancer, lung cancer, mesothelioma, and interstitial lung disease at increased rates. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration, known as OSHA, is tasked with ensuring protection for all workers. OSHA has a disclaimer on its website that it, quote, recognizes that many of its permissible exposure limits, PELs, are outdated and inadequate to protect workers' health. In Louisiana, local communities often have not even received the benefits of the tax revenue from these facilities. The state's industrial tax exemption program exempts major industrial facilities in Louisiana from most property taxes for up to a decade. ITAP cost local taxing bodies $1.48 billion in foregone taxes in 2018. That's 33% of property taxes collected by the state. This is an issue of justice, and that's why it's so important that we're having the hearing. And so I look forward to hearing the insights that each of you bring from your lived experience. And with that, let me turn to opening comments from our co-leader of the committee, Ranking Member Mullen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, as we discuss plastics, you know, we got to talk about reality too, and I have a statement that I do want to read. But I do want to say that I think understanding the plastics that we have, the reliability that plastics bring, and the amount of technology and that we use plastics in, would say that everybody on this committee thinks this is an important topic. I do want to point out that the reason why we're not having a lot of people here is because we have a lot of committees going on. And in fact, we have a markup happening in another committee that I currently sit on. And if it wasn't for so many different hearings going on, I think there'd be a lot more people here, which we appreciate all the witnesses that are here and the people that's in the audience. Because I think we can all agree that this is something we got to pay attention to, but how do we do it without making us more reliant on other countries? How do we do this without limiting the ability for us to continue moving forward in society as a whole? Because everybody here relies on plastics. Everybody here has plastics either on your feet or on your clothes right now. Everybody here that has a cell phone has plastic. Everybody that was driven here by either the metro or by a vehicle relies on plastics. Every electric vehicle out there cannot be produced without plastics. Everyone that goes to bed and wakes up in the morning and takes a shower and dries off with a towel relies on plastics. Everybody that goes grocery shopping and buys your food relies on plastics. So it's not as though we can just limit it. It's just how can we do it better? And so we got to have the open conversation when we're talking about this, Chairman, is how can we do it better? And I'll point this out also in my opening statement. I don't believe we have a plastic problem. We have a recycling problem. And we have to learn how to make recycling valuable, where it allows us to be able to use that as a value base. And if we ignore that issue, guys, then you're ignoring the reality. Because what is going to replace plastics? If someone's got a solution for that, then we'd probably already be there. But there isn't. I would like to first start by thanking our witnesses here today for attending this subcommittee hearing, including Mr. Kevin Sunday and Ms. Donna Jackson. Today's hearing highlights an original novel idea called environmental justice that has been transformed away from its original intent of helping poor and marginalized communities with specific needs into a social movement Democrats have taken over to push progressive policies forward under the disguise of social and racial equality. I think all of us in this community can agree to this. Everyone deserves clean air and water and access to reliable energy sources that will help create a cleaner, healthier, and safer future. What is missing from the discussion is that critical role the U.S. plays in manufacturing essential plastics, materials that are used in medical applications, helps deliver our clean water, can't get water delivered to you without plastic piping, and keeps our food fresh. Some witnesses today might make statements that plastics are harmful to your health, but they ignore the fact that plastics are already heavily regulated in the U.S. and have had to go through intense, rigorous standards guided by science to be used in applications, especially when it comes in contact with your food and your medicine. When it comes to facilitating siting for these companies, they're not just investing in the buildings or land, they're investing in the communities by providing jobs, health care plans, economic growth, and in the surrounding area. These benefits provide widespread, you guys are welcome to be here, but whoever keeps interrupting us, they either need to behave or they need to be removed, Chairman.
So I hold a lot of town halls in Oregon, and I do so in every county. And we have what we call the Oregon Way, which is listen thoughtfully, and if you passionately disagree, still be very respectful of the person speaking. And that includes members of the panel of the Senate, and that includes those who are testifying. I really appreciate you all being here because these are really important issues that have been totally under-examined by Congress. But again, please do respectful. If you feel like you need to say something, go out in the hall and say it, and then come back in. Thanks.
I want to reiterate this. I enjoy the passion. Passion what drives this country, guys. But respect is also there. I raise our kids on 4 things: honesty, hard work, respectful, and being responsible. And I promise you, I'll respect you, but that respect needs to be returned 2 ways. When it comes to facilitating siting for these companies, I'm going to restart this. They are not just investing in our buildings, they are investing in buildings or the land. They're investing in our communities by providing jobs, health care plans, economic growth in surrounding areas. These benefits provide a widespread opportunity for access and stability in rural states like Oklahoma. These are not short-term investments either, and it's in the manufacturing companies' interest to ensure good relationships with the communities around them. Not only because it's the right thing to do, but it's because the labor pool is likely from within the very community that they work in. Something I want to make clear, it is that we don't have a plastic problem, we have a recycling handling problem. Instead of halting infrastructure projects or manufacturing development that results in U.S. job loss and more reliance on countries like China to produce critical material needed for modern life, why would we not refocus in improving recycling? As I mentioned in our previous plastic subcommittee hearing, recycling means plastics that get reused, which is most productive through innovative technologies like advanced recycling. If we oppose a science-based solution that makes it possible to capture and reuse large volumes of used plastics that is currently going unrecycled, do we really care about plastic waste? Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you. Now we're going to turn to our witnesses, and I'm so appreciative that you all are bringing your knowledge and your lived experience to bear. We're going to hear first from Angela Bradford, who is currently a doctoral student in physiology and medicine at Tulane University School of Medicine. Ms. Bradford also serves as a volunteer at Sierra Club's Delta chapter. Ms. Bradford, please proceed.
Okay, thank you so much. Good morning. Thank you, Chairman Merkley and Ranking Member Mullen. I appreciate the invitation to speak today. My name is Angela Bradford, and as you've said before, I'm a volunteer with the Delta chapter of the Sierra Club and also a doctoral candidate earning my degree in cardiovascular physiology. I love my life in South Louisiana, as my family has been in South Louisiana and Mississippi for generations, though it is a complicated life where basic human rights are always being challenged. But we can do better. When I look out across Lake Pontchartrain near New Orleans or the Chafalaya Basin, I am affirmed that we must do better. Unfortunately, after decades of inaction, the climate crisis is fully evident in Louisiana. Our spring and summer nights and afternoons are getting hotter and more humid, which makes it harder to cool off at nighttime. I split my time between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, and it is only in recent years that Baton Rouge reached air quality attainment per federal standards. We still struggle with an F rating by the American Lung Association, however, as recently as 2019, due to petrochemical plants and other emissions producing ozone that combine with increased temperatures. I experience frequent headaches and migraines and asthma attack on those poor air quality days. Our region has had many major hurricanes in the past years, but there's no national insurance market prepared to serve as a safety net for any of us in this nation. I would like to own a home and have a family soon, and I'm just not sure how responsible this is right now. When it comes to my work as a biomedical researcher, weeks to months can be lost to a hurricane that quickly strengthens overnight and leaves me little time to power down my experiments. Many of us in South Louisiana know all too well how the assurances made to our communities by energy and utility systems go out the window when we most need them. Despite these realities, the same industry most responsible for knowingly exacerbating climate change, the industry that dominates public policy and politics in my home state of Louisiana, is unleashing yet another catastrophe on this planet, this time in the form of plastics. In December of just last year, ExxonMobil Baton Rouge announced plans to double their capacity in polypropylene plastics, increasing the Gulf Coast capacity to 450,000 metric tons per year. Per Defend Our Health's recent study, PET, or polyethylene terephthalate, I've practiced that so many times, plastic, releases 1,4-dioxane, an industrial solvent and carcinogen during production into drinking water. It can damage cells in the liver, kidney, and respiratory system. Their study also spoke to 150 chemicals out of 193 that they looked at that leach from our plastic bottles into the water or beverage that any one of us are drinking. As we discover chemicals produced from plastic processes, we recognize their power to damage organs and cells. Often, any given person does not live next to or breathe the air of just one plant's emissions. There may be multiple plants clustered together. And any one of us exposed to the water and discharges of that plant is also drinking from soil that has been contaminated, or swimming in polluted waters, or eating food from soil. I already said that, sorry. It has historically been difficult to study the cumulative effects of polluted air, soil, and water at the same time, particularly because of it is unethical within the lab context to just give people plastics-derived carcinogens and chemicals and see what happens. But also, people move and have different exposures and stressors that complicate understanding of disease processes. But nonetheless, exposure over time means increased likelihood of chronic diseases in addition to cancer. When we think about life in this country, something we often debate, we need to also think about the dignity of life we are offering when we are allowing these companies to carelessly raise our healthcare costs and poison our people. While some folks may see oil and gas on the one hand and plastics on the other as very different issues that require different solutions, I see them as one and the same. That is, the same companies reaping profits from all ends of the supply chain, from cradle to grave of their products and of our bodies. And I'm left to wonder, to which part of the plastics life cycle, to the oil and gas industry, are we ready to sacrifice our dreams and our lives? I am no longer willing to offer up my life for any more industries, and the plastics industry must be stopped with no exceptions.
Thank you for your testimony, and we're going to turn now to Sharon Levine. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name.
That's correct.
Oh, thank you. The founder of RISE St. James. Levine has long served as an environmental justice advocate. I look forward to your statement.
All right, thank you. I would like to thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak to you today. My name is Sharon Levine, and I'm a lifelong resident of St. James, Louisiana. I was a special education teacher for 38 years at St. James High School. I retired in 2019 to do this work. This was my high school, the one that my father, Milton Cayette Sr., integrated in 1966 when he was the president of the NAACP's local chapter. I'm a mother of 6 and a grandmother of 12. I live in the 5th district of my parish, which is 85% African American. On one side lies the Mississippi River, on the other lies sugarcane fields surrounded by petrochemical plants and refineries. It is making us sick. We cannot drink the water, plant a garden, or breathe clean air. The place I remember being so beautiful and full of life is now called Cancer Alley, which runs from New Orleans to Baton Rouge. We call it Death Alley, due to the high number of community members getting sick and dying from cancer. In 2016, I was diagnosed with autoimmune hepatitis. In 2019, I was diagnosed with aluminum and lead in my body. My fruit trees no longer bear fruit. Members of my family and community say that their children have trouble breathing and they are experiencing skin rashes, nosebleeds, respiratory ailments, and cancer. I've lost neighbors on both sides of me to different forms of cancer. Everyone here either has cancer or knows someone with cancer. It seems like I am now heading to funerals just about every week for another neighbor or friend. In spring of 2018, Governor John Bell Edwards announced the approval of Formosa Plastics, a $9.4 billion petrochemical facility to be built 2 miles from my home. Community members said it was a done deal. That did not sit well with me. In the fall of 2018, we formed Rise St. James, a faith-based organization focusing on protecting the air, water, and soil of St. James Parish from toxic industrial pollution. Formosa Plastics would cover 2,400 acres with its chemical plants right on top of the former Acadia and Buena Vista slave plantations. If Formosa is built, it will be a death sentence for St. James residents. Formosa would double air pollution in my district and triple our exposure to cancer-causing chemicals like benzene and ethylene oxide. We have fought all the approval given to Formosa and stopped them. We must make sure it never gets built. Many other toxic industries are trying to move in, but we must stop them. We are not leaving our community. We need industry to leave. They get tax breaks, and we get sickness and death. And for what? All in the name of profit. These industries are big climate polluters. I survived Hurricane Ida, but my home didn't. I watched oil spill out of a holding tank. I lived out of a trailer for many months, and I'm still working to recover and rebuild. President Biden, the EPA, and the Army Corps, and other agencies should use the tools they already have to protect us. And you, Congress, could do so much by defending existing laws and passing new laws to protect communities and stop building petrochemicals and fossil fuel projects here in St. James and everywhere. I am here today because we are still not safe. Once again, thank you for having me.
Thank you very much, Ms. Levine, and thank you for your previous work as I understand, as a teacher, because education is so important to the next generation. Our next witness is Mix Tandazo, and Mix Tandazo serves as a statewide environmental justice organizer for the New Jersey Environmental Justice Alliance. We're pleased to have you.
Good morning. Thank you. Buenos dias. And thank you, Senator Merkley, for the invitation to testify this morning. My name is Chris Tandazo. I use they, them pronouns. I'm the statewide environmental justice organizer for the New Jersey Environmental Justice Alliance. NJEJA is a 20-year-old statewide environmental justice organization in New Jersey. We collaborate with grassroots partners to identify, prevent, reduce, and/or eliminate environmental injustices in our communities. NJEJA is led and staffed by majority people of color who are also members of the community burdened by polluting facilities and toxic infrastructure. NJEJA, alongside other environmental justice organizers, collectively advocated for and led the way in the passage of the landmark New Jersey Environmental Justice Law, S232. The primary purpose of the EJ law is to require the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection to evaluate the environmental and public health impacts on overburden communities when reviewing permit applications for certain facilities. NJDEP then has the authority to deny or condition certain permits due to cumulative impacts of pollution. The EJ law is a beacon of hope for communities like mine. I immigrated from Ecuador to Irvington, New Jersey when I was 15, where I lived until my late 20s. Living in Irvington, the presence of industrial facilities, trucks, and warehouses was and remains a regular everyday sight, which made me accustomed to living in pollution and seeing this as normal. I didn't think to challenge the presence of industry. It wasn't until I had the opportunity to attend graduate school that I learned about environmental injustice and was then introduced to the grassroots movement that has courageously fought for the health and safety of our communities. I realized how my life, my health, and the well-being of my family, my entire community, had been and continues to be impacted by the presence of toxic pollutants that are detrimental to human health, to our health. When I think of plastic waste, I think of environmental justice communities at the front line and back end of the plastic crisis that have directly and disproportionately experienced the harms of the entire life cycle of plastics. The plastic crisis starts and is particularly acute in places like Cancer Alley in Louisiana, like Ms. Sharon had just mentioned, where the petrochemical industry has exposed Black communities to high levels of toxins, causing extreme rates of cancer-related illnesses and deaths. Some of these toxins come from the fossil fuels used to make plastic. The industry also adds many unnecessary toxins for color, rigidity, texture, increasing the toxicity of the plastic and making it impossible to recycle. As plastic waste generation increases, so does the need to dispose of it. At this stage, the plastic crisis arrives at my front door in New Jersey. New Jersey is home to 3 incinerators. All of these incinerators are located in low-income communities of color in Camden, Rahway, and Newark, where the incinerators burn plastic waste from New Jersey, New York City, and many neighboring states, alongside all other types of waste. Burning waste, specifically plastic waste, creates even more toxins and severely impact the health of our communities, such as volatile organic compounds, nitrogen dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and particulate matter. These toxins are endocrine disruptors, damage reproductive and neurological systems, and increase the risk of cardiovascular and respiratory-related illnesses, which are already, for our communities, which are already so overburdened by other polluting infrastructure and socioeconomic challenges. I myself deal with respiratory issues. I'm congested most of the time, and it makes it hard to breathe when I'm being active outside. Many people close to me have asthma. And you know what makes this even sadder? According to a recent study by Earth Justice, from 2004 to 2022, New Jersey ratepayers, including myself, have paid over $60 million in renewable energy credit subsidies to the incinerators in New Jersey. I don't know about you, but this doesn't sit well with me. It doesn't sit well with me that my communities, my family, myself, we have been paying the incinerators to basically pollute us and to sacrifice us to a slow death. The current disposal of plastic waste in our communities is a manifestation of environmental racism present in zoning policies that allow for the siting of incinerators and petrochemical industries in communities similar to mine throughout the country. So we collectively urge this body to take proactive steps towards environmental justice, plastic reduction, to address the plastic problem that we have, and to alleviate the burden on our communities face. Thank you for your time and to ask me for testify today.
Thank you very much for bringing your insights from New Jersey. Our next witness is Kevin Sunday, the Director of Governmental Affairs at the Pennsylvania Chamber of Business and Industry. Mr. Sunday, the microphone is yours.
Thank you, and good morning, Chairman Merkley, Ranking Member Mullen, members of the committee and staff. It's an honor to appear before you this morning. My name is Kevin Sunday, Director of Government Affairs with the Pennsylvania Chamber of Business and Industry. We're the largest broad-based business advocacy organization in the Commonwealth, representing nearly 10,000 members of all sizes and from all industrial and commercial sectors. Our state is the #2 producer of natural gas and the largest exporter of electricity in the U.S. We're a major producer of construction materials, food, medicine, and other life-sustaining products, and several of our members have important advances underway to establish a circular economy that minimizes water and plastics waste. And as you deliberate on this issue, it's our position that policy must expand opportunity for all our citizens, advance sustainability, and support economic growth. High energy prices are a regressive tax on the most vulnerable, and domestic energy development is paramount to addressing energy poverty here and abroad. Now, one of the key criteria in defining an environmental justice community is the percentage of households or individuals in poverty. These communities want jobs, so we must embrace and pursue tax and regulatory policy that doesn't drive investment away from these communities. The pandemic and recent supply chain shocks have made clear how important it is for Pennsylvania and our nation to have a robust and reliable supply of energy and life-sustaining products. I'm proud to represent a state that's dramatically improved the nation's energy security and put it at the leaderboard for emissions reductions. Not only is Pennsylvania now measuring attainment through the increased use of domestic energy for all NAAQS criteria pollutants, but our diverse energy portfolio has positioned us as the second leading state for greenhouse gas emission reductions. And shale gas development, which has the lowest methane intensity of any production basin in the world, according to the Clean Air Task Force, is estimated to be responsible for more than 60% of the total domestic greenhouse gas reductions since 2005, putting the United States ahead of the next 4 countries combined for aggregate emissions reductions. Our state's chemical industry supports more than $24 billion in annual economic output and 55,000 jobs. Like most North American chemical manufacturers, they rely on natural gas and petroleum feedstocks for 99% of the building blocks for more than 70,000 different products, including a variety of medical devices, products, and vaccines. And these feedstocks are also used to produce ammonia and fertilizer, which are necessary to provide food to a growing global population. According to the US EPA, manufactured goods from recycled materials typically requires less energy than producing goods from virgin materials and thereby reduces emissions. And plastics play a key role in reducing greenhouse gas emissions and ensuring resilience from natural disasters. Our state's energy, plastics, and chemical industry are a major economic driver, but it has not been the case that plastic production operations in our state have triggered environmental justice analyses and the associated enhanced public participation process, owing both to the geographies in which they operate and the nearby demographics. Nonetheless, there remains an extremely protective and stringent regulatory regime applicable to these facilities and operations. Our members are leaning in, from a refinery in southeastern PA being recognized by a historic leader in the environmental justice movement for the company's community engagement, to an innovative zero landfill plastics recycling facility in Erie that's empowering the community to increase their own waste minimization efforts, an initiative that's being undertaken in partnership with community groups, the US EPA, and with support from legislators across the aisle, including Senators Casey and Fetterman. As state and federal regulators define policy goals with respect to environmental justice, the implementation of these goals must come through clearly articulated, objective regulatory standards established by statute and through a rulemaking process that are applied fairly and allow communities to thrive. Pennsylvania's approach to environmental justice has, to date, established a process that's ensured public participation from impacted communities and a permitting process that's produced durable permitting decisions. I want to reiterate that disadvantaged communities are in need of investment, and that investment will not come without tax and regulatory policy that encourages it. So let me close by saying that we at the Chamber strongly support the announcements from leaders on both sides of the aisle, including Chairman Carper and Ranking Member Capito, on legislation to enact meaningful permitting reform to drive more investment forward. Congress, in a bipartisan manner, has over the past several years implemented key regulatory and permitting reform provisions in defense, energy, and infrastructure bills, and most recently, the debt ceiling. There's widespread agreement on both sides of the aisle, by business and by labor, that we can pursue further environmental progress while cutting red tape. In fact, it's the only way we're going to. So thank you for the opportunity, and I look forward to answering any questions that you may have.
Again, I'll please ask folks to take your comments outside in the hallway. Thank you. So we're going to dive into the questions, and I think, are we doing 5 minutes? 5 minutes apiece, so that we can have multiple rounds as desired. And I want to start out.
Ms. Jackson didn't skip.
Oh, I'm sorry, Ms. Jackson. Let's.
I promise he did not do that on purpose. We disagree on a lot of stuff, but he's not rude.
So let me back up here. Welcome. And Ms. Jackson is the Director of Membership Development at Project 21's National Center for Public Policy and Research. And now you have the floor.
Okay. Chair Merkley, Ranking Member Mullen, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for allowing me to testify today. My name is Donna Jackson, and I am the Director for Membership Development for Project 21, the Black Leadership Network of the National Center for Public Policy Research. Project 21 is one of the oldest and largest Black conservative think tanks in the country. Our members come from all walks of life, from small business owners to law enforcement, to assembly workers, to teachers, energy producers, clergy, and healthcare workers, and more. Most of us are not career activists, lawyers, or lobbyists, and more than a few of us actually live in the communities we hope to improve. We cover a wide range of issues, but our fundamental focus is lifting people out of poverty and dependence into prosperity and self-sufficiency. I'll make my main point up front, and I tell you, I think it is an overwhelmingly positive thing for struggling communities to have industrial facilities nearby, including plastic manufacturing. The high-wage, blue-collar jobs that these employers provide are in many cases the best ones available for those without college degrees. And if you look at the history of the creation of a Black middle class over the last century, it is these gateway jobs that lifted up millions of families and broke the cycle of poverty. I know that in my own family history, I can point to relatives who worked at Ford, General Motors, Chrysler, U.S. Steel, and General Dynamics. Not only were they able to provide for their family, but they were able also to become homeowners and save for retirement. Perhaps most importantly, they were able to provide educational opportunities that allowed the next generation to attend college and pursue various professions. And as a result, their kids and now grandkids have never had to suffer even one day of poverty or helplessness. To be blunt about it, it's downright crazy to suggest that my family would have been better off if these factories would have never been allowed to be located near them. And it is not just the direct jobs. Every big manufacturing facility supports many small businesses in the community, and quite a few of these vendors are minority-owned. They also contribute to a tax base that pays for things like schools and police protection. But none of that can happen without the local industrial base, whether it's a plastic plant or a refinery or an automaker. Now, we'll hear a lot about the environmental dangers of living near or working in these facilities, including the plastic plant, but I think a sense of perspective is in order. American manufacturers are subject to the most rigorous environmental standards in the world, including plastic plants, and industrial emissions have declined substantially over the last several decades. For every study claiming a cancer cluster or statistical association with some other disease, there are others that find low-income people living near these facilities are no worse off than comparably poor people in general. And I think it's worth noting that the environmental justice activists who focus on weak correlations between industrial emissions and healthcare impacts tend to ignore the undeniable and well-documented improvements that come with the transition from poverty to well-paying employment. Beyond reduced illness and disease, good jobs tend to lead to stronger families, substantially lower rates of domestic and sexual violence and other traumas. And as far as my relatives who worked for big manufacturers are concerned, the only difference I could see in their health was the benefit of having better medical care that comes with a good salary. I might add that several of my factory worker aunts and uncles and cousins are still with us, and some have celebrated their 100th birthdays. In conclusion, the enemy is not trace emissions in the air and water from industrial activity. The enemy is poverty, and that is why any attempt to shut down good industrial jobs will do a lot more harm than good in communities and to the people who need these jobs the most. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Jackson. And now we'll begin our questions. And Ms. Jackson, you noted that a number of your relatives worked for different automobile manufacturers and so forth, and as I listened to that list. Do you see a difference sometimes between manufacturing that involves, for example, making cars, and the type of a plastics production plant that has a low number of jobs for the amount of and a high level of emissions?
I think that all the manufacturers are subjected to strenuous regulations. Our EPA is actually doing a great job. Now, if there's really this high correlation, and I don't pretend to be an expert, if it's really this damaging, we should have Michael Egan in here answering to why they're not doing their jobs.
Thank you. Ms. Bradford, so in the community you live in, if we were talking, instead of about a plastics plant, we were talking about an automobile plant, would you have a different sense? Is there something particularly dangerous and damaging about the chemical and the plastic plants?
Good question, first of all. I would say my concern's all emissions, regardless of the source and regardless of what's being produced. But just for today's topic, of course, it's plastics. And so I think with the research that we're seeing from independent researchers, from colleges and universities, from agencies around plastics, it's just becoming more shocking the level of chemicals that are leaching into, for example, the recent Defend Our Health report that studied 193 chemicals and found 150 of them leach into plastic bottles. That's a big deal. And so now that we know more about everything from the production of plastics to drinking out of plastic bottles to the waste discharges into the water and so on and so forth, microplastics in the ocean, all of these are confounding factors that are leading to some serious health consequences, not just environmental.
Thank you. And Ms. Levine, you noted that you suffered autoimmune disease and you're going to a lot of funerals. Is there a higher correlation of devastating diseases near these plants than far away from these plants?
Yes, I think that there is higher because, just like I said, we are called Cancer Alley, and St. James and St. John Parish are the worst two parishes down this corridor between New Orleans and Baton Rouge. Especially in St. John Parish, they are suffering with chloroprene, and the plant is called Dinka DuPont. And these people are suffering even worse than us. And more people have been diagnosed with cancer, and more people are dying with cancer than St. James is next to St. John. And we are dying with cancer. And at one time, we had like 2 to 3 funerals in 1 week. And prior to me starting this work, I wondered why. And then I started doing the work, and I found out about all the pollutants, because we have 12 industries within a 10-mile radius. We are sandwiched in, and people over there are sick. People have asthma. Children are being born preemies. Women are having miscarriages, and you can't breathe the air. And just like on one of the slides, you could see mosaic with that yellow sulfur is open. When you pass by that plant, you get a whiff of that odor, and it goes in your nostrils and goes down to your throat, and your throat is irritated. And my daughter had to move because she was always going to the doctor for sinus, ear infections, and my other daughter had to move because she was always having headaches. I'm still there. My 3 children are still there. The other 3 left. And my neighbors, people are dying. And our little area is like a skeleton town, because our public officials allow industry to come in the 5th district the most.
Right. I will submit for the record, if there's no objection, a number of articles that show the much higher concentration of cancer rates and other disease rates near these facilities than far away. So I think your observed experience is very well documented in the scientific literature.
Thank you.
Thank you. I want to turn Mix Tandaza. You mentioned the burning of plastics as a strategy for disposal, and that I think you said 3 incinerators in New Jersey. You also mentioned the New Jersey environmental law And is that law a response to some of these challenges, and did it improve the situation?
Thank you for that question. Yes, the EJ law was definitely a response to the environmental injustices that communities in New Jersey face, particularly in the Ironbound, similar to what Ms. Sharon's mentioned. The Ironbound has 5+ industrial facilities, all of which are located within a 5-mile radius next to an entire neighborhood. And the folks and the organizers that fought for the EJ law came out from these neighborhoods, and it has been happening. It was a 20-year-old battle. Dr. Nikki Sheets has been pushing for this law for cumulative impacts to be passed in New Jersey, and this landmark law, the rules just got passed this past Earth Week, and now we have regulations, and right now we're preparing to see what's going to happen. And so far, it seems that the EJ law is triggering a lot of facilities that are trying to be sited in all over New Jersey, and the facilities are trying to be sited in communities of color in particularly. They're not going to the suburbs, they're not going to the rural areas, they're going to urban settings where communities of color live. So we're preparing ourselves to fight these proposals, and the EJ law now gives us the support to do that, because the law will not allow any facility that adds any additional pollution to the area where they're trying to site. So let's
Thank you. So my time has expired, but when I come back, I'm going to pick up where we left off, because what I will want to understand is how is it that these incinerators continued operating after violating their air permits more than 1,400 times, and also why they would get $60 million in renewable energy subsidies for the purpose of burning plastic and creating pollution. We'll turn now to Co-Chair Senator Mullen.
Thank you, Chairman. Ms. Bradford, in your testimony, did I understand you right, said that you want to end all plastic manufacturing?
I said the plastics industry must be stopped.
So does that mean end plastic manufacturing?
I mean, in my dream world, sure, but I think that, go ahead.
No, so I don't mean to be condescending here. I just point out, what's going to replace your glasses? Like,
So
how
I
would you wear
do
your
know,
glasses around your face? They're made of plastic.
maybe.
No,
I don't
they
know
are.
what they're made out of.
They are. What about, and I just point out some things here, because I just want to be realistic when we're having conversations, because when statements are made like this, I just want to open people's eyes and say, well, okay, that's easy to say, but what's the solution? Your water bottle in front of you.
This one?
Yes. That plastic?
No.
The lid is. That's plastic.
Right. So
Right.
I would say to
your
your
cell phone-
question that I would first be concerned about single-use plastics, and then we can talk about alternatives to this.
Your cell phone there. Is it plastic?
The cases, but it's glass because I broke
Oh, the components
this
inside of it's
screen
not
yesterday.
plastic? The components made out of it's not in plastic? They are. The water that you filled that water bottle up with, where'd you fill that water bottle up out of?
A water filling station.
All right, and it was delivered by a drink station that was plastic?
I didn't check.
The edges are. The piping coming to it. Now, you have a couple choices with the piping. We could go back to using wood, but then you have to line it in chemical. Or we could go back and use lead, because we used to have water piping that was lead. That was harmful to us. We go back to galvanized, but galvanized rust and had discoloration. We go back to copper, but copper has to be mined, and everybody wants to stop mining in the U.S. So you use plastic to deliver piping that you fill that water bottle up with today. I point this out because the clothes you have on, I guarantee you have plastic in it. The shoes you have on your feet, the soles of those shoes are plastic. So we talk about any plastic manufacturing, and everybody in here cheers when you say that, but everybody here is depending on plastic as you set. So if you want to end it, then quit using it. It's kind of like, I don't shop at certain places right now because I don't agree with some of their policies. I choose not to do that. You can choose to not use plastic. Do your work. If you believe it, then live it that way. And if not, then tell me what the solution is. Mr. Sunday, can you manufacture a car today without plastic? Because we talked about manufacturing, the chairman brought up manufacturing cars as it is safe, but the components that go into the cars today, can you do that without plastic?
No, Senator, and increasingly so with the new mileage mandates. You increasingly need to use automotive components that are plastics derived.
So we wouldn't have manufacturing, today's modern manufacturing, if we didn't have plastics, correct?
Correct.
Ms. Jackson, do you agree with that statement?
Yes.
So what's the alternative for manufacturing? Because the Democrats talk about middle-class wages. Middle-class wages typically come directly from manufacturing. What is it that we're manufacturing that doesn't have plastic in it today?
Nothing, and you know what? It would increase the cost of everything if we turn to an alternative, and it would disproportionately impact low-income people who have lower incomes. It would be another regressive tax on the poor.
So according to your testimony, Ms. Jackson, it sounds like you're saying that the environmental justice agenda does more harm than good for low-income families. Is that correct?
Yes, and you know, I have the unique opportunity to see both sides when the industry comes in the area and when it doesn't. As an auditor, I worked on Nissan North America. Nissan North America moved to Smyrna, Tennessee, where it built the largest automotive manufacturing plants. And the transformation was astonishing. I mean, it went from a community that was poor to a community that U.S. World News
Wow.
voted one of the top 10 places to retire. You had poor people in areas that were poor that became middle class. You had middle class people that became upper middle class, and a lot of upper middle class people that became affluent. They have attractions, they have amenities, they have housing, affordability. I mean, the amount of prosperity in that area has resonated out 3 counties. I've also had the opportunity to see when an industrial, and that wouldn't happen if you don't have an industrial complex moving into the area where you're talking about high economics. I've also seen the other side where all of a sudden you have deteriorating buildings, empty storefronts, dilapidated housing, people standing on street corner housing, that families that are broken. So we need to balance the fact that people's lives need economic upward mobility. And we can't just say, we're going to take out an industry and leave people poorer than they were. Poverty causes the worst health care in this country. Poverty is the one that destroys lives. It destroys health. It creates trauma. So we need to make sure that when we're talking about these issues, we take into account the human loss of life, not just the environmental impacts.
Thank you. Thanks for your indulgence there.
Senator Whitehouse.
Thank you, Chairman, for your persistent focus on the plastics problem that we face. Mix Tandazzo, the U.S. plastics recycling rate is less than 10% once you actually put it in the blue bin. For single-use plastics, about 2% of the feedstock is recycled. The rest is all new. And the industry is recommending that, as an alternative, we go to high-heat waste disposal facilities like pyrolysis facilities. Do you have a view on what dangers those facilities pose for adjacent communities?
Thank you for the question. Yeah, those are what I would consider schemes to deceive this body and anybody into thinking that they're actually doing some good. If you're burning plastic, you are still emitting the toxics and the chemicals that are used to make plastics are still being burned. That happens whether you combust them in incinerators or you gasify them through pyrolysis or gasification. It doesn't matter which avenue you choose to process the plastic, it's still going to emit some sort of chemicals. And what's important to think about that is when we're thinking of where these so-called alternative recycling, plastic to fuel industries are going to go cited at, I will most definitely bet you that it's going to go to low-income communities of color, and where the industry is already taking control over the zoning laws, so they have the support from the municipalities to actually go ahead and continue to be cited in these places. And that's why the EJ law is important, because the EJ law would allow communities themselves to hold the corporations accountable from and actually do a process to prove that their operations are not going to harm our communities.
Thank you. Ms. Levine, I'm getting ready to reintroduce my Reduce Act bill, it's called, that puts a 20-cent per pound fee on the sale of new plastic that is destined for single-use products, to try to help with that 2% number where there's so little recycled plastic being put into single-use plastic. The plastics industry was not very helpful in that regard and ran ads against my bill in Washington with images of things like child car seats and bicycle helmets. I'm not really sure that those are single-use items in real life.
Well, I know
But I'm interested in your view on how the proliferation of single-use, throwaway plastic items implicate communities like yours, not only in the U.S. but around the world.
I think that we can gradually get away from so much plastics. I think we have too much, and the health effects of making these plastics are killing the people, are making us sick, giving us cancer. And when I was diagnosed with autoimmune hepatitis, I didn't know where it was coming from until I did my research. And they said it came from industrial pollutants. And I live in a cesspool of pollution. So I believe that that's where it came from. But I feel the belief that we can gradually go back to the old days when we didn't have so much plastics, go back to glass, go back to when I was a little girl. We didn't have so much plastic, and we weren't sick. So maybe we can get together and find solutions, find strategies, sit at the table and discuss these things. And I would like to be a part of that discussion, because we need to find ways to reduce so much plastics and also stop the industries from coming in poor communities to make these plastics.
Mr. Chairman, there are some, I think, pretty reasonable minimum standards that we should start pushing towards. One of them was put forward at the Oslo Oceans Conference by the European company Unilever, which has pledged, I think starting in 26, to take out of the world a pound of plastic for every pound of plastic that it puts out into the world through packaging and through products, to go plastics neutral, if you will. Well, if a company as big as Unilever can do that, that shouldn't be asking too much for American companies. This is an announced policy, and I think it would have a very positive effect, and in fact, it would create a market for getting plastic out of the world. And I think it would be particularly helpful in poor countries to have an international market of waste plastic that people can take out of their communities and get paid for cleaning up their communities. So there are plenty of levels of engagement, but clearly if a company as big as Unilever can make a commitment like that, that is not an unreasonable ask. Thanks for your attention to this problem.
Thank you, Senator Whitehouse. Senator Sullivan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to begin by thanking my friend and colleague, Senator Whitehouse, on this topic of plastics and ocean cleanup. He and I have been tag teaming for a number of years on the Save Our Seas Act 1.0, the Save Our Seas Act 2.0, which the Congressional Research Service called the most comprehensive ocean cleanup, ocean debris legislation ever passed in the history of the Congress. That was very bipartisan. Trump administration, now Biden administration, we're implementing that. So there's a lot of bipartisan work going on in this area of plastics and cleanup, particularly for our oceans, which I think literally everybody agrees with. So I'm looking forward to continuing to work with him, this committee on the next phase of that, which I think is very important. The title of this hearing, though, I want to dig into that, the topic of environmental justice a little bit more from our witnesses, because in my state, the great state of Alaska, there's a real double standard on environmental justice. You know, the Biden administration talks about how their report on environmental justice listed a number of projects that, quote, will not benefit a community, including fossil fuel production, pipeline development, even possibly roads. This is ridiculously naive, in my view. And what I worry about sometimes is when we talk about environmental justice, the Native people, the indigenous people of my state, always get left out of the Biden administration's views. So maybe for the witnesses, shouldn't environmental justice include indigenous people in Alaska? Does everybody agree with that? Everybody's nodding. I'm assuming that's not a trick question. It's just a pretty basic question. I think the answer is yes, Mr. Chairman. And yet, whether it's the King Cove Road, that's a road that would connect the community King Cove, it's a native community in Alaska, where they've been trying to build a 12-mile single-lane dirt road to an airport that would save lives. This administration is now opposing it. Secretary Holland, every radical lower 48 environmental group opposes that. That's not environmental justice. We had a bill of mine, the Alaskan Native Vietnam veterans, getting land, native allotments to Alaskan natives who served in Vietnam. Secretary Holland won't implement that at all because radical lower 48 environmental groups don't want Native Americans who served in Vietnam when most people are avoiding service to get land. Is that environmental justice? Hell no. That's not environmental justice. The Ambler Road, which this administration has now reversed, that was supported by a number of indigenous communities in Alaska, create jobs. So my point, Mr. Chairman, is a lot of talk about environmental justice, but when it comes to Alaska Native people, indigenous people in my state, almost 20% of the population, this administration targets them so often, and their claims of environmental justice are just, I don't know, they are really harming the people of my state, particularly the Native people, the indigenous people. And so I don't want an exception for environmental justice. Shouldn't be an exception. You guys agree? I think everybody, this is not a controversial statement. Indigenous people in Alaska should be getting the same benefits that everybody else does under this rubric of environmental justice, but they don't. So I'm just going to let that stand here, Mr. Chairman. It's a big issue for me. It's hypocritical by the White House, by the way. But let me just ask a general question, maybe Mr. Sunday, Ms. Jackson. And again, I've worked hard on the issue of plastics and pollution and making sure we don't pollute our oceans. But one thing I do worry about is that if we crack down on plastics here, the production of that is just going to drive it overseas to China, places that don't have strong environmental standards like we do. Is that a concern, and should we be making sure that any action or legislation we take doesn't have the perverse impact of driving operations and jobs to China, where their environmental standards on the production of plastics aren't nearly as high as ours? You have a view on that, Mr. Sunday?
Yes, Senator, thanks for the question. It's the right perspective. As I mentioned in my opening statement, the U.S. greenhouse gas emission reductions are greater than the next four countries combined.
Yeah.
China's is greater than all the OECD nations. So I'd
I mean,
rather we use our...
China's going up the other way.
Correct.
And ours are going down. Right,
Good.
because of the revolution in the production of natural gas, correct?
Yes, sir.
Ms. Jackson, do you have a view on that in terms of, we don't want plastic production going to the dirtiest producer, which is China, and then taking our jobs away. You have a view on that?
Yes, it's our economy that's always being attacked, even though we're the least polluters.
Yeah.
China is the greatest polluter.
Right.
But yet they're being able to get the benefit of when we attack our economy, when we kill our jobs, we push them over to the biggest polluter. If you really believe that plastics are a danger to the planet, it should be a danger no matter where it's produced.
Correct.
But somehow only Americans are being penalized.
So we don't want to kill jobs and then send production to China that will pollute the environment globally even worse.
Yeah, I mean, I think it just goes to the narrative that we don't really believe this. It's this kind of where we want to just signal that we're good people. But if you care about people, you care about all people. And if you believe that plastics are harming individuals, why harm other people overseas? How come they're expendable? And it shouldn't be that way. But again, this country is subject to the most rigorous regulations. And those companies are actually meeting those standards. And if they're not, why is it Michael Regan in here talking about why we're not making sure that our companies are not adhering to those standards? Because nobody really believes that.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Sullivan. So we're going to have additional 5-minute rounds as people would like. One of the things I find interesting about the plastics conversation is when we identify some of the significant harms that have developed as the production of plastics has increased, it's often pointed out that, well, there's plastics in almost everything. And this is pretty accurate. Nylon is a plastic in our clothes, Dacron, et cetera. But when you have harmful effects, it isn't the right answer to say, well, there's nothing that can be done. And so one of the conversations is, how do we distinguish between necessary uses of plastic and those that are not necessary? Because maybe we can reduce those harmful effects by reducing how much we produce. And when we produce it, how do we produce it in a way that's less harmful to the communities in which it is located? How do we reduce the emissions and reduce the cancer and the disease rates there? And when it is used in our consumer economy, how do we reclaim it in a fashion that it doesn't end up in our rivers and in our oceans, affecting our ecosystems? How do we reduce the amount of microplastics? Because I can tell you, in the health of our children, having the fact that we now consume the equivalent of a credit card of plastic a week through microplastics in our food and our water, that's a very serious health issue. So I want to encourage a conversation that is based in reality, that there are real issues, that plastics have real roles, but we may be able to work together through this set of hearings to develop a set of ideas on how we can keep the essential and necessary roles, but eliminate the unnecessary, or at least eliminate the side effects or reduce them. So that's the conversation we're engaged in. And Jill Bradford, you mentioned single-use plastics. And is that an area that you think is kind of ripe for us to target, to try to reduce?
Yeah, for sure. We had human existence and efficiencies prior to single-use plastics, and we can have that without them, after them. And to the point that you were making, I think that it's the responsibility of every industry in this country to come together and figure out what actually makes sense. Because yes, we can't power down everything immediately when it comes to plastics. And there are some medical uses, and of course I use them in my lab, but we haven't always. And so there's many ways to go back to less dangerous, less harmful plastic or non-plastic material. And then also we know from recent reports that have come out that there are alternatives to a lot of the chemicals that are being used that, because maybe they're cheaper, are not being replaced. And so we need industries, the petrochemical and plastics industry, to replace a lot of the chemicals that they're using.
And, you know, one of the chemicals that gets significant attention in plastics are endocrine disruptors. Is that something you're familiar with?
Yes.
Can you maybe explain that for us?
Yeah, so when you think about the endocrine system, you're talking about hormones, and hormones regulate a lot throughout the body. And so essentially plastics are, their chemicals are disrupting the natural processes of your body, and that can lead to autoimmune diseases or dysfunction of kidney, liver, central nervous system. Endocrine disruptors have several different negative effects and can be carcinogenic as well.
There's various studies that have suggested that there is a link between plastics, which we end up inhaling or eating, and the effects upon breast cancer, prostate cancer, and for that matter, sperm production. Should Americans be concerned about these types of health impacts?
I will say I would be concerned across the board with all of these things, and I think it's only now that a lot of researchers are thinking through not just the historical ways in which we thought, you know, maybe diabetes or cardiovascular disease or kidney disease develops, but what role does plastics now play in that? And we are seeing that, you know, in our country, we have a lot of chronic diseases that have not been, we have not gotten under control, that we're still seeing increased diagnoses for people. And you do have to start to wonder, and hopefully we'll see more money for research in the areas of determining the role that plastics play in those diseases development.
Thank you. And I want to turn Mixed Tadazo to the conversation about the new law in New Jersey. And so is it kind of the bottom line is that better regulation can reduce some of the harmful effects?
Yep, that's right.
And is it a combination of federal regulation and state regulation?
I think that will vary depending on what situation we are talking about. I think at the state level, it works for New Jersey because it's a small state and it's fairly easy to regulate and have larger oversight over the state. I think at the federal level, it would get a little more complicated because of the different zoning policies that different municipalities have in their different states.
So the incinerators have violated their air permits more than 1,400 times since 2004.
Mm-hmm.
Were those, I think those air permits would have been state air permits. Am I correct about that?
Mm-hmm. They're
so this
state.
is state enforcement.
Yeah.
And so do we need better federal regulation to Ms. Jackson's point about if we're concerned about states and places that are violating the emissions or have very high emissions, do we need more federal supervision of how states enforce these toxic emissions from plastic production?
I think there is an opportunity to do something at the federal level, but I think it would definitely be more efficient to do something state by state. I think the federal government can support by emphasizing different procedures and regulatory systems that can be implemented in different laws, but it is possible to do it at the federal level. President Biden just passed the Executive Order for Environmental Justice this past Earth Month, and it would be incredible if we can pass that executive order into a law, because then we would have more federal oversight over not just polluting industries that work at the state level, but also polluting industries that work at the federal level, because a lot of them can be also, they're not fully oversight by the state. Some of them have federal legislations too.
Thank you. We've been joined by Senator Markey of Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for this important hearing. Here's what I know. Japanese women in Japan contract breast cancer at only 1/3 the rate of Japanese women once they move to the United States, and their daughters are growing up their whole lives. So in other words, there's something in American culture that then affects those Japanese women once they get here. And within the first generation, a Japanese-American woman has breast cancer at twice the rate as a woman of Japanese origin in Japan. So we're doing it to it. Is it in our food? Is it in our air? Is it in the toxics? What are we doing to ourselves, right? What is it that's going inside of the people in our country that has their genes misspell? So that now, there is a disease which is induced in an individual. So we know historically that toxics have been identified as one of those real culprits, and we know that all of you have spent your lives in working on those issues. So, Mix Tendazzo, can you speak to some specific costs that you've seen as a result of plastic waste incinerators?
Yeah, we can talk about the cost to the ratepayers and the cost to the health. New Jersey folks in urban communities already face a lot of socioeconomic challenges that come from lack of access to proper health care, economic resources, healthy jobs. And so when, sorry, just kind of crawl back.
I'll come back to you.
Yes,
just
thank you.
Do a little thing. Let me come over to you, Ms. Levine. Cancer Alley, people are 50 times more likely, on average, to get sick than other people in America. And again, that's kind of an analogy over to Japanese women in Japan, Japanese women here. So you're a good example of what happens when there's some proximity. Can you expand upon that and what you think are, one, the causes of it and what the remedy has to be?
Well, I think that when you come into Cancer Alley, you're susceptible to get something. I had a young girl from New York came to stay with me for about 5 months, and she became ill from breathing the air. She said when she wakes up in the morning, she have a headache sometimes, and she started to feel dizzy or lightheaded. So she's not from here, and for her to experience that, I can imagine what other people coming to Cancer Alley will experience that. And I always ask people to come to the area where I live, next to Donaldsonville, that's where the hotels are, and spend a night at the hotel and wake up the next morning and tell me if you smell something.
Yeah, when I was growing up in Malden, Massachusetts, I lived in Ward 2.
Oh, boy.
I still live in Ward 2 in Malden, Massachusetts, and every city has a sacrifice ward. And the Malden River is in Ward 2, 3 blocks from my house. And my mother would always say to me, Eddie, whatever you do, don't swim in the Malden River, because it was black with a pre-Jimi Hendrix purple haze over it. So I knew I wasn't, Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn on the Mississippi reading those books. And your mother says, don't swim in the river 3 blocks from your house. Then it was the chemical companies, the coal companies, they all just dumped it all in the Malden River. So you live in that ward.
Yes,
In
I
Louisiana.
sure do.
You live in the petrochemical
I sure do.
sacrifice zone,
Sacrifice
Cancer Alley.
zone.
And every city has that ward where everyone thinks they can put all of those
I
dangerous
don't think that should be. I think we have the right to breathe clean air and drink clean water. I don't think that we should be a sacrifice.
So, and beyond the dollars, the human costs, the healthcare costs.
Yes.
Can you just expand on that a little?
I think industry should pay for my illnesses because they made me sick.
Yeah, thank you. And
You're welcome.
do you agree with that, Ms. Jackson?
I think that I feel sorry for the illnesses that she's suffering. But at the same time, I know that there's some studies agree and some studies don't agree. But I feel sorry, and I hope that she feels better. That's what I can say.
Okay, thank you.
There's lots of studies out there. Some say there's a direct correlation, some don't. So I think we don't know enough information to be able to tell.
Well, you know, from at least from my perspective, I think there's a pretty clear correlation that has been established. I know up in Woburn, Massachusetts, when I was a young congressman, this mother came to me with her little boy, Jimmy, and he had leukemia. And what she had done was then go door to door to door to door to door in her ward, and she found another 5 children with leukemia, all within 3 or 4 blocks. And that, so I helped to bring in the EPA to do the big study, and it eventually became a movie called A Civil Action that, you know, kind of spotlighted this Woburn case, and all of those children died. But we were able to come in here and just make sure we clean up that site. They were dumping all of those chemicals, Monsanto and others, into the ground and into the water, you know, and young children were being exposed to it.
Senator Markey, can you stay for another 5-minute session?
Yes, I may. Yeah. So, oh, I'm sorry, and I'm sorry to run over, but anyway, thank you all so much for your courage in standing up, because we just have to do something about this. This is a crisis in our country. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Mullen?
Yeah, I just want to follow up with Ms. Bradford. You stated you're against single-use plastics. What specifically are you pointing at for single-use? What products are you talking about?
Thanks. So definitely straws, definitely plastic bottles. I won't say anything else because I can't think of anything else right now.
So are you for recycling and advanced recycling?
No, because it doesn't work and it doesn't happen.
Well, then in your case and everything's single use at that point. If you're not for recycling, then you can't say you're against single use and you're okay with everything else. Because if you're against
I'm
it,
for
then you're against
facts,
all of it.
and I think only 9% worldwide are actually recycled.
That's why I say that we should focus more on recycling. Because if you can tell me you're for recycling, then maybe we can work to something. Because a while ago you did say you wasn't against all of it, because you got to be realistic, but you're against single use because that's what the chairman asked you. And so if you're against single use, then you must be for recycling.
No, because it doesn't work.
Well, then that doesn't make any sense at all.
Okay.
Because you can't exist without plastic today. We've already pointed that out. And so I don't know what the alternative is, and we talk about this all the time. It's like Ms. Levin mentioned that that glass is an alternative. But if you remember, sir, at our last hearing we had on plastic, for the record, I submitted the McKinsey and Company study that showed that actually plastic has a less carbon footprint than glass. So where are we moving towards? What is it that we want to look to? If we're still for the middle class, and we got to have manufacturing, we pointed that out, that we can't do without it. We're against it, but yet everybody here is using it. I just see a lot of people having a thought process because it sounds good, but no one's actually living by what you believe.
I don't have any single-use plastics in my house.
You know that for a fact?
I know that for a fact because
And what
I
products
go.
do you not have? What products? Because you just mentioned water bottles,
I don't have water bottles like that in my house.
but most of these water bottles are actually recycled, including the one that I'm having.
So I am a masochist and I do participate in recycling. I just know that it doesn't work internationally. It's not adding up.
Well, I would suggest you maybe doing your homework a little bit more when you come up here and you start talking about this stuff, that you actually understand what it is, the impact that you're talking about.
I do my homework. I do understand the
And you
impact.
can't-
I do know I'm wasting my time recycling because most of it's not recycled.
Then,
And that's because of the industry. And the fact
Okay.
that plastic is in everything is because the industry forced us to have
then
it.
quit using plastics.
Well, the industry should stop making them.
Quit using them. If you feel that way, then
I
quit.
do. I just told you I do not have single-use plastic bottles in my house. I
But
do what
you're
I
against-
can.
Hold on a second. You're against all plastic, but you have plastic all around you. So if you're against plastic, then don't use it. Live by what you're saying. There's a lot of people around here that I disagree with, but if you live it,
I do live
I
it.
respect it. Ma'am, you don't, because you have plastic on your face, you have plastic on the water bottle, you have plastic on your
I
feet,
do
you have
not
plastic on
own
your phone.
companies to create these things. So I cannot make these things. But until they are available, we're stuck with some things. I do what I can.
Do you believe in, do you believe that we should have solar systems, or not solar systems, but we should have solar panels on our house?
I do, but I'm here to talk about
So solar panels. are
what's
made
on the
out of plastic.
agenda.
I mean, they are.
And they're also not single use.
Neither is just bottle. Let's go to Mr. Sunday. In your opening statement, you mentioned shale gas was a big reason why United States have led the world in CO2 reduction because the energy and natural gas liquids in your manufacturing is less emission intense than overseas manufacturing, especially compared to countries like China. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Can you explain a little bit more about that?
Yeah, as I mentioned, Clean Air Task Force looked at the methane intensities, and shale gas in Appalachia has the lowest leakage of any basin in the world. And the increased use of natural gas produced in that region, including Pennsylvania, has been estimated to be about 60% of the reason why we led the world in reducing emissions as a country since '05. So big picture, the issue is how do you reduce emissions, keep costs down, and be reliable? That's the long-term challenge. The short-term challenge is every country out there that's relying on Russian oil and gas, we should be doing everything we can to get our energy over there because it's also going to be used more sustainably. Because I can guarantee you, you can see the Boston Globe feature from a couple years ago when an LNG tanker came into Boston. When we got shale gas in northeast Pennsylvania, it's the most prolific in the world. I definitely want the producer standards in my state versus Putin's regime. We saw what that led to.
Do you know what the difference between the two standards are?
It's an order of magnitude. I mean, it's so much so that even if you count for transportation across a tanker, shale gas in the U.S. shipped across the seas is more sustainable than pipe coming in from Russia.
Because they're not using electricity in the ships to bring them here? They have combustible motors in them?
Right. Yes, sir.
Okay, that's what I was thinking. And trucks to get them to point A to point B, since we can't build pipelines in the East Coast right now.
Right.
With that, sir, I'll yield back.
Thank you very much. The chair of the committee has arrived, Senator Carper.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I start today, I just want to thank all of you for joining us. I want to thank our witnesses for coming and speaking with us, sharing some ideas with us, responding to our questions. People sometimes ask me to explain what is environmental justice all about anyway, and I just met a bunch of students earlier today from all over Delaware, future farmers of America, and one of the things that we talked about was, believe it or not, Matthew 25. Matthew 25, which goes something like this: "When I was hungry, did you feed me? When I was thirsty, did you give me to drink? When I was naked, did you clothe me? When I was sick and in prison, did you visit me? When I was a stranger in your land, did you welcome me?" And I think we have a moral obligation of the least of these in our society. And I think what environmental justice is all about is just that how do we meet that moral obligation to treat other people the way we want to be treated? It's just that simple, golden rule. Treat other people the way we want to be treated. But it's an issue that turns out environmental justice invokes quite a bit of passion, and as evidenced by the hearing here in this room today. And we meet in this room not every day of the week, but throughout the week, throughout the year. And there's oftentimes great passions that are vented in this room, as you might imagine. But environmental justice is also an issue that invokes strong emotions that come from the experiences that we have lived in our lives and have felt the impact of, in some cases, of disparate government policies. I thank our chairman, Chairman Merkley. I want to thank our ranking member, Senator Mullins, for inviting you to convene here to give you a chance to share your thoughts with us and to give us a chance to ask some questions of you. And I believe that it's incredibly important to create productive space, if you will, for having an important discussion like the one here today. And I would close by saying, before I ask a question, that we need to treat each other with kindness. We need to treat one another the way we want to be treated. That's the way I try to do that as chairman of this committee, and I hope that's, I'm sure that's the way that Senator Merkley has chaired this committee hearing today. So, a couple of questions, if I may. Go down the list, first of all. Just Sharon, you go first. Where are you from?
I'm from St. James, Louisiana.
Welcome. Yes.
Thank you.
Angel Bradford, I split my time between Baton Rouge and New Orleans.
Good. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Well, I'm originally Ecuadorian, but currently live in Jersey City, New Jersey.
Okay. Yes.
I'm from Maryland.
Okay. Neighbor.
Neighborhood.
Our neighbor. Yeah.
Not originally from here. San Diego, Nashville, several places around the country.
I like the way you say Nashville.
Nashville.
Please.
Harrisburg, Pennsylvania.
All right, good to see you. In April of this year, our president issued an executive order on environmental justice that directs federal agencies to take steps to address cumulative impacts on environmental justice communities. That includes a meaningful public participation in agency decisions making. I've always been a strong supporter of engaging with the communities early and often, and we had a great hearing here on permitting reform just a couple of weeks ago. And interestingly enough, the business community was the one that was strongest on the idea that, as we move forward in permitting reform, we've got to reach out to communities that are at risk and involve them early on, get their opinion early on. I was very encouraged by that. Here's my question. What would meaningful engagement look like for each of the communities you have worked with? What would a meaningful engagement look like for each of the communities that you have worked with? And how would you like to see agencies update their procedures in accordance with the executive order to foster more meaningful discussions with communities? And Ms. Where's Ms. Bradford? Yeah, would you answer that first, please? What would meaningful engagement look like for each of the communities you've worked with?
Right. So meaningful engagement, I think first things first would be transparency. And I don't want to say education because, we're not dumb in Louisiana. Like, we understand a lot when it comes to the environmental policies that exist. But because there's so many different agencies involved, it would be really helpful if at the federal level there was more engagement in New Orleans and Baton Rouge and in between, all along the Gulf Coast, as it pertains to the different commenting periods and procedures for decisions around permits for these plants and for plastics in particular.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think another meaningful thing would be, and I often hear the pushback around, oh, well, you can't prove this, Exxon pollution led to this, and just really starting from a place of understanding that our country doesn't have a lot of things that other countries do. So a lot of these studies do admit, being low income and poverty does impact these things, not having universal health care and access to health care that's not connected to your job, but also pollution. All of this comes together to lead to the outcomes that we see, and we know that, and we're not trying to say, and we need to make sure the communities understand that their voice still matters, that we can't silence them by saying, oh, you can't prove this was because of this, therefore what you're saying is not true.
Good. Thank you, ma'am. Sharon, how do you pronounce your last name?
Levine.
Levine.
Yes.
Levine, thank you. Okay. Same question, if you would. What would meaningful engagement look like for each of the communities that you have worked with, please?
I don't understand the question.
Okay, let me just go to somebody. Chris, same question, if you will. We'll come back to you, Sharon.
Okay.
Yeah. Chris, any thoughts?
Yeah, definitely. I think I would actually like to mention the environmental justice law again, because the environmental justice law actually has meaningful the environmental justice law in New Jersey actually has meaningful engagement as part of the policy. So the way that it happens is that when a facility wants to create a new, industry in a community, they have to go through a process through the DEP. The DEP then analyzes whether this facility is going to have any sort of additional polluting contributing with more toxic pollutants to the community. And then it calls for a public hearing. The public hearing involves community members. The community members have to, the DEP is responsible, not the community, the DEP is responsible for holding these community hearings in which they invite the facility that has the air permits, and they invite community. So the community then hears the permits and then they decide, this is what we want. We don't want this, we do want this, and if we want it with certain, we want it to be healthy and separate waste. And then the DEP goes into, analyzes that, and then the facility has to do an environmental justice report back to the DEP to make sure that they're not actually adding any pollutants. And if they pass, then they get approval for their permit. But if they don't pass, their air permits gets denied, and so then they don't get constructed. But this is how the EJ law has made sure that community is 100% involved in the entire process of what facilities are going to go into our communities.
Thank you very much. Sharon, I'm going to come back to you, and I'm going to pronounce your name correctly. Is it Levine?
Levine.
There you go. And here's a new question. Through your testimony, you shared with us the impact that decades of pollution have had on your community. And what is it, St. James Parish?
Yes.
St. James Parish in Louisiana, including disparate health outcomes for communities of color. In order to support the Louisiana Department of Environmental Quality in addressing these disparities, the EPA recently announced a grant to the state agency funded through the American Rescue Plan and the Inflation Reduction Act that would set up an air monitoring project in St. James Parish, your parish.
Yes.
Here's my question. What kind of impact will this EPA grant have on you and on your community in St. James Parish? And additionally, are there other actions or engagement efforts from EPA that have been effective in helping your community in St. James Parish?
Well, in my community in St. James Parish, the people don't have a voice. The politicians make the decisions. They don't follow protocol. And we get the bulk of the impact of industry and the pollution. If the people had a say-so in what's going on in our community, I don't think any of this would be happening to us. And in Congress, we need to involve the people in making these decisions, the people that live in those communities that's impacted. If you want to see what's going on, Congress need to come to the communities, the local communities, and see what's going on for themselves before they make these decisions, because it's killing the people. And I think we should have people's lives protected instead of industry being protected. And that's what's happening in St. James.
All right. Mr. Chairman, my time has expired. You've been very generous with it, and I appreciate that. Are we out of time?
Thank you very much, Chairman. Well, we're actually going to Senator Markey, and then we can come back to you if you'd like to ask some more questions.
Go ahead, Eddie.
Do you want to go?
No, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So when Ms. Levine says that you're 50 times more likely to get cancer in Cancer Alley,
Yes.
that is a correlation. It's not twice as much.
Yes.
50 times as likely to get cancer if you're living in those areas that
Yes.
are immediately proximate. And renewable energy is displacing fossil fuel energy in Texas, in Louisiana, and states all across the country. So the fossil fuel industry is actually looking for a new market for their product, and it is plastics that they're looking at, where they'll use their fossil fuels. And when we see an increase in plastic production, it does not benefit the communities. It actually benefits the oil and gas companies.
That's right.
So the bottom line is that we've got a plastic bottle right here. They could use another substance, to make the bottle, but they use plastics. And you really can't do a lot about it. You've got plastics in your house. You got plastics, right here on the dais.
I know we do.
And we don't get options, okay? That's the problem. In the same way that the auto industry didn't want to build in seatbelts. Are you not going to drive? No, you have to drive to work. The auto industry didn't want to put in airbags. Are you not going to drive to work or to school? No, you have to drive. You want the safeguards, but the auto industry didn't want to put it in. So it took regulations in order to make sure that we would have those safeguards in place. And by the way, the mining industry, they didn't want to put in any safeguards for the workers. You know, black lung disease, you just have to run the risk, right? No protections. So we can see the whole trend here in terms of how these sacrifice zones are created near those plants. So could you just expand a little bit more, Ms. Bradford, on that and your experience on those issues?
Expand on
On the toxicology related studies that do show
Yeah, for sure.
the correlation to disease when a human body is exposed to these toxic substances.
Yes, so there was a paper published late last year by Dr. Terrell and Dr. St. Julian around air pollution being linked to higher cancer rates among Black or impoverished communities in Louisiana. And they concluded that regardless, our analysis, so I will provide context. So just like I said before, they did speak to the fact that low-income communities, low-income Black communities in particular, don't have access to health care and preventative care for sure. And so in addition to that, they were able to provide evidence of a statewide link between cancer rates and carcinogenic air pollution in marginalized communities and suggest that toxic air pollution is a contributing factor to Louisiana's cancer burden. And the last time I checked, Louisiana's cancer burden, I believe we were second in the nation and fifth for mortality, just for, various reasons for those differences. And then, I was trying to look up studies for Baton Rouge with their major petrochemical complex with Exxon and Formosa Plastics in Baton Rouge, but the studies are coming out more, but it's hard to get the point source from these. Sorry, what were you going to say?
Thank you for your great work. Thank you.
Yeah.
I agree with you 100%.
Yeah.
Mix Tandazzo, I have 1 minute left.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Can I just get your concluding thoughts here, what you wanted to say?
I'll follow up on this as well. Yeah, I do think that we have a lot of, it's not just like one facility that's exposed, that we're being exposed to. It's not just one fossil fuel plant. It is several fossil fuel plants in one neighborhood. It would be different if we were like, I don't know, there's like one facility and like miles away from a neighborhood. But this is literally sited right next to like people's houses. And I think we often tend to forget of how much people lack health care to be able to take care of themselves. A lot of these communities have socioeconomic challenges and lack access to a lot of these resources that if you actually had universal health care, there probably wouldn't be as much death happening because folks would be able to go to the doctor and check themselves and be like, hey, something's happening, I am not feeling well. And a lot of the people in our communities don't have that.
This is just such an important hearing. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for bringing this great group together. We just have to learn from them and then act. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator Markey, and we're getting close to wrapping up, but I wanted to mention a couple things. I like the analogy that my colleague represented about cars. Cars are essential, but when they were without seatbelts or airbags or bumpers or crush zones, there were a lot more people died. And in this case, we're trying to figure out how the pollution can really be limited, the bad effects can be limited. I was kind of struck about the conversation about water bottles. We have 3 examples up here. We have a glass, so it can be used 1,000,000 times. We actually have a pitcher, and this pitcher is not glass. I'm not sure about the one on your table there. They look like maybe those are glass. This is not. So we have, but both of them are reusable thousands of times. And then my colleague had a plastic water bottle, and it's designed for single use. Some states have deposits on those bottles. Oregon was the first to have a returnable deposit, and it massively decreased the pollution. At that time, it was all glass, but it was often shattered, broken glass. And as a kid, I was a Boy Scout. We were out picking up glass shards all the time. And when we did in Oregon the first return bill in the nation, which was 5 cents, which would be equivalent to a quarter today, well, they just disappeared completely, because if somebody else left one, you picked it up yourself, and people are like, yeah, for the equivalent of 25 cents today, you didn't waste it. And then we had another problem, which was the flip top on aluminum cans, and those little flip tops, sharp, and they were being digested by animals and stepped on, and feet were cut. And so Oregon said, oh, you can't have detachable flip tops. And the industry was like, that's crazy, that's impossible to solve. The day that went into effect, all the cans in Oregon had an attachable flip top. It was a solvable problem. There are solvable problems in the plastic pollution that we are suffering, and that's what we're working to solve. And there is a difference between a glass that can be used 1 million times, a plastic or glass pitcher, and using instead, over the course of time, thousands of water bottles. And those water bottles, in the states that do not have a deposit on their water bottles, the recycling rate is often under 20%. And in the states that have a deposit, the rates are almost always over 60%. And Oregon increased its return from 5 cents to 10 cents, and we saw a jump, because 5 cents is not what it was back in the 1970s. So I just want to conclude. I know we didn't get to the question where the vote's underway, and I guess I'm one of the last to vote, so let me check. I have a little bit of time. Okay, so I think to the degree that we can recognize that plastics are going to be with us in many capacities, but we can seriously reduce the pollution that comes from the production. We can seriously decrease the roadside pollution that comes from plastic waste. We can not site any more facilities in places where they're going to harm the surrounding communities. We can have better regulations on emissions and better, if you will, monitoring of those regulations, which brings me to my question, which you mentioned in your testimony, that these incinerators kept operating, but they had like 1,400, since I think it was since 2004, air violations. So there's a standard, but when you're talking about 1,400 times it was documented, how many knows how many thousands of times it wasn't documented?
Right.
I mean, so they just ignored them. Mm-hmm. And so was it just the cost of doing business? Well, if we get fined, doesn't really matter. I mean, the first time you get fined, it's like, well, should we fix this problem? Right. But if you're getting cited over 1,000 times, it's clear you're just ignoring. So why did it not work? Why were they not brought into compliance with the emission regulations?
It's just a lack of oversight or lack of authority to oversight the permits from the DEP. And yeah, it's just like a lack of oversight that they didn't have before, and now they do because of the EJ law.
Okay. And you mentioned that these plants are receiving, I think you said, maybe I misunderstood, I thought you said $60 million of subsidies.
Yep.
Recycling subsidies or renewable energy subsidies. So they're burning plastic, emitting toxic chemicals that harm the surrounding community, and getting money from the state.
Yes, basically. So this is because, again, I mentioned earlier, schemes of false solutions and different names and terminologies that these industries use, such as alternative recycling that was mentioned here tonight a couple of times. That's the same as chemical recycling. The incinerator industry uses waste to energy to label themselves, or municipal solid waste, municipal solid waste. And because they label themselves this way, at the federal level, they have been recognized as a renewable energy resource. And because they're recognized at the federal level under the Renewable Portfolio Standards Program, they receive federal funding, federal subsidies for renewable energy credits. Yeah, so basically they lied about what operations they do in order to get to make it seem like they're actually green energy. And the claim is that they're a renewable energy resource because they're able to generate energy from burning trash, which would then mean that their source and the resource that they need in order to constantly generate electricity over the decades, it's trash. So that means that they are dependent on trash, that there's no incentive here to reduce the amount of trash or plastic pollution that goes into anywhere. They need this incentive, so they're not trying to stop the production of plastic. And so when we have policies like extended producer responsibility that can hold them accountable and reducing the amounts of plastic, then we can, they're gonna have to start being holding accountable. But we are actively working to get the incinerators removed from the renewable portfolio standard from the federal program because, and that's just $60 million for the New Jersey incinerators. We have also been paying out-of-state incinerators, and overall it's like $160 million that we have paid from 2002 to 2024, and I can give you the report on that. And on top of that, the amount of energy that they produce is like 1% of energy, so that's not renewable.
I recall when I was a kid and camping, someone said, whatever you do, don't throw any plastic into the campfire because the fumes are toxic. Like everybody knows, the fumes from plastic are toxic. And yet here we are incinerating it and putting those toxic fumes out into the surrounding community where they're producing much higher cancer and disease rates and also when the plastic is being made.
Definitely.
Ms. Levine, you mentioned, or the conversation came up about sacrifice zones. The idea that, hell, we've got low-income communities, they can't fight something effectively, so we'll just put this toxic, polluting plant and squat in the middle of them, and maybe they'll get a few jobs. And you have fought that successfully. To what do you attribute your success?
Oh, my God, I spoke to the good Lord, because the politicians don't help us, the governor don't help us, industry is poisoning us. So I had to go to God to ask God what to do about the problems in my community. When I saw all these funerals that I was going to and didn't know why. And then I also wanted to say, when I was a little girl, we didn't have this problem. We didn't have pollution. We were never, ever sick. My parents, my grandparents, we live off the land. We weren't sick. So there must be some type of solution that we can come to the middle and figure out what we're going to do. We don't have to go everything cold duct with plastic, but we should gradually come to some conclusion where we can live and breathe clean air and drink clean water.
So these zones where there's extensive emissions that are making people sick and killing them, so-called sacrifice zones.
Yes.
Mr. Sunday, would you like your family to live in a sacrifice zone?
I want any facility to operate under the environmental conditions that have been enacted by the majority of a legislature, and then a rulemaking process that affords public comment, and then rigorously enforced.
So just to be clear, if you were aware that your child is moving to a new location and their proposed location is right next to a plant in which there are extremely high cancer rates and other diseases caused from those emissions, you would say that's just fine?
This is the other part of public engagement. It is not just the voice of the communities where the facility is going to be, but a discussion from the regulators about what the strict standards are going to be enforced at the facility. And armed with that knowledge, folks can make their decisions.
Yes, but what would your decision be?
I think that people need to have economic mobility and make the decisions for themselves and be involved in the public process.
Yeah. Well, my answer would be very different. I have two children who are just now starting out on their careers, and they may well be moving a lot. And if they were moving to a location next to a plant that had high cancer rates and emissions, I would say, do you really want to live there? Because, you can't undo the damage that comes. And I think most every parent in the world would say the same thing. And I realize you're here representing a point of view and you didn't want to really answer the question, but I suspect you wouldn't want your children in that situation next to a toxic death-creating camp production facility either. So let's keep working towards understanding that we have to have conversations about the effects. We can't ignore them. There are very real health and pollution impacts on humans, on communities, on our ecosystems, and then let's figure out how to diminish the problem. It isn't as simple as it was with no flip tops, right, on cans. That was an easy fix. But industry fought that like crazy, absolutely cannot figure out how to do it. They had the solution instantly, as soon as they were required to do so. And I think if we create enough conversation about the need for change, then industry will help us work together to come up with solutions. So I want to thank you all for bringing your knowledge and your real experience to bear. This is an incredibly important conversation about one of the least understood yet most significant toxic challenges in America. With that, the hearing record will remain open until, I have a script I'm supposed to read on that. You got it? So, the record will remain open through the close of business on Thursday, June 29th. We will send the questions out to our witnesses. We would appreciate a reply by Thursday, July 13th. And with that, the hearing is adjourned. Thank you.